Good evening, everyone. My name is Vicki Goodman, and on behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Open Mind with Dr. Stephen Hinshaw. Now, Dr. Hinshaw has the unique distinction of speaking at 3 Friends of Semel Open Minds. He is the first speaker that has ever spoken for us 3 times, and that is because he is a prolific and world-renowned author of 12 books and over 325 articles and publications. Last time he spoke at a Friends of Semel Open Mind, he spoke about his book, Mark of Shame, The Stigma of Mental Illness, and Agenda for Change. And the time before that, it was the ADHD explosion, myths, medication, money, and today's push for performance, which is considered the go-to book about ADHD. In his spare time, Dr. Hinshaw is a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley, where he was department chair from 2004 until 2011. He's also the vice chair for psychology and professor of psychiatry at UCSF. He received his BA from Harvard and his doctorate here at UCLA. His work focuses on developmental psychopathology, clinical interventions, mental illness stigma, and ADHD, a subject on which he is considered one of the country's foremost experts on. His new book, which he is here to speak about this evening, Another Kind of Madness, A Journey Through Stigma and Hope of Mental Illness, features his family experiences of mental illness with a pointed call to reduce stigma. Following Dr. Hinshaw's presentation, we will take questions and answers from the floor, which is unusual for us. We usually put them on index cards, but this evening we are going to pass the microphone to those of you who would like to ask a question of Dr. Hinshaw. And following the Q&A, there will be a book sale, and Dr. Hinshaw will be in the foyer to sign his books. A few announcements before I invite Dr. Hinshaw to the podium. Just a calendar of our upcoming events. This Sunday, we are going to be screening the Academy Award film Coco with the director. He's going to come from San Francisco to be with us. That event is actually sold out. But for those of you who are members of the Friends, if you haven't bought your tickets yet, membership does have its privileges. So as American Express always says, so we always do save seats for our members. So if you want to come to Coco and you are a member of the Friends, please let us know. On May 2nd, together with the Resnick Hospital Board of Advisors, we are presenting our inaugural Wonder of Women #WOW Summit. We are bringing together speakers such as Lisa Kudrow, Candice Bergen, who last time I spoke I called Murphy Brown. Tipper Gore will be with us that day, and many UCLA luminaries in health and science. So I hope that you will all consider coming. It is a fundraising event for mental health education, raising awareness for research, and for clinical care programs at UCLA. So I hope you will all join us for WOW. On May 14th, we're going to screen Heaven is a Traffic Jam on the 405, which won the Academy Award for a short documentary this year. The director, Frank Stiefel, will be here, and the artist, Mindy Halper, who the film is about. All of these events are posted on our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org, where you will also find pictures of past events, and your picture may be there if you've been with us before. And there you will also find a link to join our community of Open Mind supporters. If you have not already become a supporter of the Open Mind, we really welcome your support, and we need your support to continue to bring these programs free to the public. So please join us. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Stephen Hinshaw.
Thank you, Vicki. Thanks, friends of Semel and UCLA. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to first talk about stigma. I'll show a few slides. I am a professor, so I have the right to do that. But soon enough, we'll detour for most of the evening into some reading of passages and a story of my family's journey through, as the subtitle of the book states, the stigma and hope of mental illness. So what is stigma? Literally, and if you were here for my Mark of Shame talk a couple of years back, you'll know, stigma, a Greek term like most psychological and psychiatric terms, back in the day conveyed a literal brand burned into your skin. Let's say you were headed to the Agora in Athens. Might be a good idea for you to know if this fellow citizen, or was it a citizen, next to you had actually fought for Sparta, or maybe was a former slave. But you would know automatically because of the brand literally burned into their skin. Literal branding doesn't occur as much in modern times. Hitler branded people in concentration camps who included not only Jewish people, but gay and lesbian people and people with mental infirmities and mental illness, gypsies, Roma. Some countries branded HIV positive people in the 80s. But most stigma today is inferred. It's psychological. We know you're a member of that group. There's something flawed about you and your group members. There's a lot of names of groups up here that receive stigma. Some of them seem a little quaint today. Left-handedness. I mean, if you're left-handed today, you go to MIT and you have good spatial abilities and it's kind of awesome. My grandmother back in Ohio didn't want my sister to be left-handed. As social norms change, as social mores change, formerly stigmatized attributes may not be much concern. But sadly, tragically, today, even in attitude surveys that rely on your answering a Likert scale, want to be with this group, don't want to be with this group, overt measures, what are the bottom three? Which of the three groups you don't want to be a part of if you want to avoid stigma? Do you have a mental disorder? Do you have a home? And/or do you abuse substances? Things change. We'll talk a little bit later about attitudes toward gay marriage that have changed radically in our country in the last 15 years. Attitudes toward mental health have changed hardly at all, and in some ways are worse. So I wrote this book some years ago called The Mark of Shame, Oxford Press, and whom did I choose for the painter of the painting for the cover image with my editor at Oxford? Some of you are at an age where you had his other paintings on your dorm walls, The Descent into Hell, The Garden of Earthly Delights. It's Hieronymus Bosch. And what's the title? This is a detail of the center of his triptych. What's the title of this painting? The Extraction of the Stone of Madness, or as it's sometimes called, the Stone of Folly. Because in Holland in 1496, when he painted this, the term for mental illness was really thought to be, and the medical condition was, you had a rock inside your skull. So we see the surgeon, but the surgeon's wearing a wizard hat, so we know there's a problem already. We see the surgeon with the scalpel, trephining, cutting a hole into the poor patient's scalp to extract the rock of madness. The priest with the chalice is giving a blessing. The poor patient is the only one giving us eye contact. Now, if you've got really good eyes, and this painting is hanging in the Prado, 1496, under a lot of varnish, this is a not so great PowerPoint, it doesn't exactly look as though a rock is emerging. See if I can use the pointer. From his head. See the little white tufty things? Bosch was painting that the surgeon instead was removing a flower from the patient's head. What was the colloquial term for mental illness in Holland in 1496? You were called a tulip head. Tulip was the big item of commerce. It still is in the Netherlands. So in an eerily modern way, Bosch was portraying, if you read the history, whether in fact if the surgeon removed the label, the tulip, maybe the mental disorder would be cured. So it's a surprisingly modern painting in some of its implications. That's why I chose it. In 1950, a very famous book came out from 3 Berkeley psychologists and 2 Berkeley sociologists called The Authoritarian Personality. Why did so many German citizens follow Hitler? The idea was, here in the post-war era, the psychologists and sociologists would figure out why a subgroup of people are bigots. There was a very psychoanalytic explanation. Harsh repressive parenting, especially fathering, even repressed homosexual tendencies, led a subgroup to become highly stigmatizers, bigots. Most of the rest of the population wasn't. Social psychology and social cognition today have essentially thrown this idea on its ear. Now, there certainly are people who stigmatize more than others, but stigma today is viewed as a product of evolution and regular old social cognition. Why did the human brain get to be the way it is? Fire, wheels, maybe it's the social groups that we have to navigate. I stereotype, you stereotype every day. There's too many people to meet. Do you have white hair like me? Do you wear glasses? Do you play sports? What's your skin color? Stereotyping may be somewhat inevitable just to navigate. Now, as a very progressive Berkeley professor, I have never engaged in stereotyping except against Stanford, our rival school. It's a private school. They wear red, not blue. They're pretty elite. Now, did you hear? No, those are all true statements, but my voice edged towards prejudice. I'm not sure I like those Stanford types. So in the social cognitive way of thinking, a stereotype may get infused with negative bias, and now I'm prejudicial, literally prejudging. And therefore, no Stanford student will take my undergraduate course through University Extension. No way, I'll discriminate. They're not allowed. Stigma involves stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, but even more, once I know the group you're in, I know all about you. Stigma takes away your individuality. So you can think about religious minorities, you can think about different skin color, you can think about people with mental disorders or developmental disabilities, and how this social cognitive process might work. Final couple of slides. If you're a member of a group that is stigmatized, and unless you've been under a rock for most of your existence, either through the campfire stories or through today's social media, you know what society's stereotypes and prejudices are. It was thought back in the 50s it was inevitable. Today we don't think it's inevitable, but it's highly likely that you might internalize those messages. So we're now in the realm of self-stigma. Public stigma may breed self-stigma. You take on those attributes as in a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, internalized stigma is quite important, sort of jumping down on this slide, for mental health in particular. Your level of self-stigmatization, even taking into account how anxious or depressed you are, predicts 2 big things. You don't go into treatment because you feel you don't deserve it, or you drop out early. So self-stigma just reinforces the vicious cycle. What's the antidote? Well, there's many. But if you're part of a group that stands up for itself and has solidarity, Black Power, Gay Pride, Women's Movement, that's a huge antidote. Until very recently, what's the group you would never want to be a part of? Like the old Groucho Marx club that would take you as a member, right? People, other crazy people. Other lunatics. What was McLean Hospital's original name in 1829? The McLean Asylum for Lunatics. Right? These stigmatizing words. NAMI, Mental Health Association, local groups, anti-stigma groups. For the first time, probably in recorded history over the last couple of decades, are providing an antidote to self-stigma because there's a group you can belong to. There's a support group that will look at legal means and look at more personal means of overcoming shame and silence. Second principle, courtesy stigma. I wish I'd met Irving Goffman. He passed away before I joined the Berkeley faculty. He was the sociologist who, among many other things, admitted himself to St. Elizabeth's Hospital back many decades ago for 6 months to see what it would be like to live in a snake pit. On the basis of that and other experiences, he coined the term total institution to refer to prisons, concentration camps, and mental hospitals. Goffman cruised the gay bars in Manhattan 15 years before Stonewall. He also wrote a book in 1963 called Stigma, Notes on the Development of Spoiled Identity. Go to Amazon and you can buy it for 25 cents tonight. It's some dog-eared copy, 120 pages, a little paperback, some undergraduate used for a sociology course. And in one of these illuminating chapters, Goffman said, look, if society bothers to stigmatize a group, it's only common courtesy to stigmatize anyone associated with a member of that group. I mean, it's just courteous. So he's being completely sardonic, like family members, like neighbors, like treating professionals. Let's face it, in medical school, is psychiatry the most preferred residency? Probably not. Is clinical psychology, although it's coming up in the world, does it have the cachet of neuroscience or cognitive science or social personality? Not quite. Because let's face it, we clinical psychologists work with crazy people. That's courtesy stigma. What about family members? It wasn't that many decades ago that we knew the cause of autism, which was emotional refrigeration on the part of parents, or the schizophrenogenic mother whose hostile, cold, demanding style caused schizophrenia, etc. So there was a double stigma of being associated, blood relative, adoptive relative, of somebody with a mental disorder, and you in fact caused it. Stigma is a tough topic. It's an ugly word. We won't do it as a group exercise now, but just say it. Stigma, the fricative, stick in your throat. I get criticized, a couple people around the country in particular, for using the term in my writings and books, because stigma, the term itself, just using it means that the people must be deserving of it. I don't like the term racism, but it exists. I don't like the term stigma, but it exists. And as we'll talk about perhaps at the end, what are some ways that we as a community and society can work to overcome this huge legacy of stigma? Of course, everybody talks more about mental health issues than 50, 60, 70 years ago, and it's true. Of course the American public knows more. We've used the same measures in population surveys since the 40s. People know twice as much about alcoholism, autism, ADHD, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. And we want to keep just as distant from those people with those diagnoses as in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Social distance hasn't budged. And in fact, 3 times more Americans in the last decade, if they hear the term mental illness, link it with aggression and violence than in 1955. What's the public face of mental illness? Violent school shooters, people living under the freeways in the Bay Area, right on Telegraph Ave, feeding into the Berkeley campus. Deinstitutionalization has turned into reinstitutionalization in prison populations. I could give a whole lecture on this. The point is that despite greater discussion and far greater knowledge and greater funding, but not good enough funding for mental health treatment and research, the public has not fundamentally changed its attitudes. In some cases, they're worse. So I don't have it on the slide, but in 2001, 38% of Americans were in favor of gay marriage, and in 2016, the number had gone up to 62%. That's a huge change in 15 years, against virtually no change in mental health attitudes over 50 to 60 to 70 years. Something is happening about humanization, something is happening or failing to happen about compassion that we need to really fight. So that's where this book comes in. Why would I name a book about our family's journey another kind of madness? In fact, madness is kind of an archaic, even stigmatizing term, isn't it, for mental health conditions? Well, I'll tell you why. From the book's preface. The inspiration for the title comes from a quote from James Baldwin in one of his masterpieces, Giovanni's Room. People who remember court madness through pain, the pain of the perpetually recurring death of their innocence. People who forget court another kind of madness, the madness of the denial of pain and the hatred of innocence. And the world is mostly divided between madmen who remember and madmen who forget. Try writing a sentence like that. Master craftsman of prose, Baldwin. So you heard the linking conjunctive phrase, another kind of madness. Of course, I cannot claim to comprehend all of Baldwin's experiences, but his words are inspirational. Regarding this narrative, as I try to make clear, stigma itself is another kind of madness, a form with consequences that are far worse than those linked to any form of mental disorder itself. More broadly, stigma fosters a denial of human potential. The silence and shame must be transformed into open dialogue. Unless we make progress toward this goal, we will never realize whom we can become as a species. Autism has a lot of impairment, so does schizophrenia. You go down the whole DSM. What's madness is to be ashamed to talk about it and to have funding levels much lower than the National Cancer Institute funds, et cetera, et cetera. So where does this narrative start? It's always hard to know. You could go back many generations, but we'll start right here in Southern California in 1936. In the late summer, scalding winds scoured the Southern California region. As the calendar reached September, the 16-year-old known as Virgil Jr. couldn't shut off the voices now shouting inside his head. Preoccupied with the growing Nazi threat in Europe, day and night he roamed the sidewalks of Pasadena, the same ones that had carried him to grade school on his metal roller skates a decade before. Begging him to save the free world, the voices grew in intensity each day. Desperate to emerge with a plan, Junior continued his relentless pacing. Not long after midnight, on Sunday, September 6th, he paused. Silent houses surrounded him in the darkness. With his shirt soaked in sweat, he suddenly gasped as a new awareness took hold of his body and mind. With thrilling clarity, he now understood he was the sole human destined to save the free world. His long days and nights of searching had not been in vain. The revelation filled him with wonder. As his thoughts gathered speed, another insight emerged. Alone among mankind, he had attained the power of flight. His arms, in fact, had become wings. Like Icarus, if he lifted them toward the sky, he'd be aloft. Once he soared toward the clouds, the free world's leaders would witness this magnificent signal and pledge to conquer the fascists. But how? If not for him, the fascists might prevail. As the early morning hours of September 6th inched toward dawn, the winds abated. Finally, a brilliant yellow-orange, the sun emerged to the east, spreading long shadows from roofs and palms. Enthralled by his energy and remarkable insights, Junior reached his block on North Oakland Avenue, moving furtively past a few yards to find his own house. Breathing in, he crossed the lawn with muted footsteps. All was silent in the early daylight. There was no turning back. But how to ascend? Thinking fast, he nimbly scrambled up the trellis, steadying himself as he found footholds. A final thrust, and he was on the roof above the small front porch, the walkway 12 feet below. The sky loomed majestically before him, the air already torrid. The voices inside his mind reached a crescendo, pleading with him to perform his deed, save the free world. Glory would be his. Approaching the edge, he shed his clothes and heaved them over, shoes, pants, and shirt floating to the ground beneath. Suddenly cooler, he held his breath. Calf muscles straining, arms outflung, he pushed off and propelled himself forward. For a second, there was only the feel of the air against his skin. The ground rushed toward him before everything turned black. So my dad's initial flight lasted 1.18 seconds. He was bleeding from his head. He'd broken his left wrist. His 3 older brothers and 2 younger half-brothers rushed out of the house. His parents were away on a trip, wondering what had happened. They hadn't seen Virgil Jr., age 16 and a half, in a few nights because he had been up wandering the streets. He kept muttering about the fascists and Nazis. They called an ambulance. One of their cousins was one of the first female MDs in Pasadena. She got him transported to LA County, where he was quickly diagnosed with chronic paranoid schizophrenia. Bipolar disorder was essentially not diagnosed in the United States between the late teens and 1970. But you couldn't hold someone at LA County with a chronic mental disorder diagnosis, so he was shipped to Norwalk. Norwalk still exists. It's undergone 3 name changes. It's one of the 5 public mental hospitals essentially left in California. On an adult unit, there was no schooling. And what were the medications he received? None. How about the family therapy twice a week? None. How about individual therapy? None. His treatment was being chained to his bed at night to prevent wandering. In November, the superintendent called Dad's dad, my grandfather, Virgil Hinshaw Sr., who had been chairman of the Prohibition National Party in the United States from 1912 to 24. It was Virgil Sr. who really got the 18th Amendment passed, and years later all 6 of his sons would drink toast to the great prohibition work of their father. Not everything is genetically transmitted. But on that night in November of 36, Virgil Sr. met the superintendent and the medical director, who said, now on admittance, your son weighed about 180 pounds. He was obviously a football player, shot putter, good athlete. And we weighed him this morning, he's 117. He believes the Nazis have poisoned the food at the facility, so he stopped eating several weeks ago. So you have to wonder why the superintendent took so long to call. In a state facility back at the time, communication wasn't so good, and the minister was called in to deliver last rites. And my grandfather, who was an inveterate letter writer, wrote to his brother up in Idaho that night saying, I believe I have seen my namesake in this world for the last time tonight. Over the weeks, months, late 36, early 37, somehow Dad attained some rationality. He turned 17. Started to eat again. In early March, the staff noticed that he had essentially recovered, so they released him. And what did his father and stepmother, 3 older brothers and 2 half-brothers, say to him when he came back? Well, they didn't want to say anything because they thought it might jinx his recovery. And it might embarrass him, so he started 12th grade 6 months late, and the family never discussed it. So the beginnings of the silence. Dad did really well at Pasadena High, went to Pasadena JC, of course it's today Pasadena Community College, was valedictorian, spoke in front of the Rose Bowl, got an offer at Berkeley for admission, but mailed back the check for $75 for tuition, room, and board for the first year, and decided to go to Stanford, which is, because he was of sound mind then, it was a very difficult decision for me to accept many years later. And at Stanford, he decided to major in philosophy, the big ideas, ethics, logic, theory of knowledge, and minor in psychology, where he studied psychoanalysis and behaviorism, the 2 big schools of thought of the day. He graduated with honors, but didn't go overseas. It was now early years of the 40s. A, the family were prohibitionists and Quakers, conscientious objectors, but B, Dad had been 6 years at Norwalk, so he was 4F. He got admitted to Iowa for a master's and then got admitted to Princeton to get his PhD in philosophy. During his first semester, the department chairman, and they were all men back then, so I use the word advisedly, said there's a visitor coming this coming winter and staying over the summer next spring, and we're to arrange you to meet with him at his home for an individual tutorial. That's the way grad school worked back then. The faculty arranged things for you, and have that one-on-one tutorial every Monday afternoon. And Dad said, who's the visitor? And the department chairman said, oh, it's Bertrand Russell, so you'll do well studying with him. It was a pretty good tutorial. And during his last year, there was a new department chair who said, we've arranged for you to meet, go across the street to the Institute for Advanced Study, and please meet Professor Einstein, and you're to write a chapter on his social and moral philosophy, which Dad did. It's chapter 50 of a big volume of physics and philosophy. I loved college at Harvard. My undergraduate mentor, Bruce Baker, sitting in the front row. I loved grad school at UCLA. I worked with Bruce and Barb Henker and many others. but I didn't get Russell or Einstein. And it's always hard to compare to family members. Bruce is just a step below. But by that last year of grad school, he started to believe that he could predict the end of the war through telepathy. Some of his roommates got worried. And then his girlfriend wasn't sure, she lived up in Manhattan, whether she would stay with him. So he took the train up, and on a winter night he was banging on the doors. The police were called, and they did a calculation, made some phone calls, and the closest large public mental facility for an involuntary commitment to Princeton was Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry. So Dad was shipped down to Philadelphia State. Byberry was then out in the countryside. Today it's essentially a suburb. McLean was built a day's carriage ride away from downtown Boston, Byberry a day's carriage ride away from downtown Philadelphia, Napa State a day's carriage ride away from downtown San Francisco. The goal was to keep mental patients, quote unquote, isolated. It was at Byberry where he received his first insulin coma therapies. You inject enough insulin to induce a seizure, his first barbiturates. And as he reported in his journals that he kept up all his life, that I saw, obviously many years later, that every week, because Dad wasn't deemed religious enough, a group of staff and fellow inmates would take him to an occupational therapy room and beat him with a whip. Now, I wondered if this were true. Maybe he was still pretty psychotic, the way he'd been back in '36. During this time, one of his older brothers, I'll show you a picture of Uncle Randall in a minute, was working in Washington as an economist for the economic office before it became the OEO, and said, you know, my younger brother, when he was at Norwalk, we just didn't visit him enough. So I am going to get, through his letters, a gas ration card. He had one day off a week every Sunday. And he got from his boss a gas ration card to drive before freeways up to Philadelphia to visit his brother at Byberry State Hospital. And Randall was a very quantitative economist, and he would take notes each week and then send them to the superintendent to see maybe there'd be an early release. So on one Sunday, about 3 months after Dad had been admitted, my uncle even got a day pass for him so he could leave the facility to go to lunch. And so they walked through the corridors and out to the parking lot and started their drive to find a restaurant. But Dad, who was multilingual, started shouting and translating the road signs into German. And my uncle said, Junior, he was always called Junior, what's going on? And Dad switched to English and he said, I'm being held in a concentration camp in Germany. You're a collaborator, get me back. And Randall, who was a very rational guy, said, no, you see, we're in Philadelphia, out just on the outskirts, and Dad had nothing of it, and my uncle threw his hands up in the air, and they turned back and sent him back to the hospital. And as he later recounted to me, well, my progress notes that day were going to do no good, so I didn't send them to the superintendent. So this was a classic example of, in a manic or mixed episode, getting psychotic enough to have a delusional belief. Until about 15 years ago, in my early researches for The Mark of Shame, we saw the cover photograph a little bit ago, I uncovered a book of photographs of state mental hospitals throughout the United States. And in one of the sections of photos, the caption read, above is a photograph of the new men's dorm at Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry. I looked up at the picture and there were triple bunk beds, wall to wall in a windowless room, and immediately I thought of the Life magazine photographs of the liberation of the camps. Eerily similar. Then I started going online. People my age took a long time to go online, but finally in the early 2000s I did. And then, fascinating, there were actual conscientious objectors who were sent to live at Byberry for 2 years rather than going overseas. And they were the ones who smuggled out the photographs of the 7,000 men on Dorm A designed for 1,400 and the starvations and the beatings and the deaths that often weren't recorded by the administration. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me that as psychotic as Dad might have been, that spring when his brother tried to take him on a day pass, there was some metaphorical truth. Dad was quite aware of the war, and the goals in some ways of the old snake pits weren't all that different from some of the goals of the camps. Now we're in the period of deinstitutionalization, which has been checkered because we haven't funded community care well enough. But it was quite a revelation to me to understand that as psychotic as my father might have been during some of his episodes, there might have been an underlying historical truth. About 5.5 months after his admission, the doctors at Byberry noticed what the doctors at Norwalk had noticed 8 years before, and they said, he's so much better, let's release him. And he took the train with his brother, my Uncle Randall, back to California. In fact, that was during late July of 45, and they were on the train in New Mexico when the test for Hiroshima went off. They saw the flash. So what did Dad do back in Pasadena? Well, he had a PhD in philosophy and 4 single-authored publications on the theory of knowledge, so he applied for professorships. At age 25, and Ohio State made him a good offer, so he flew to Columbus, and he became an instructor of philosophy and then an assistant professor. And on a blind date, 2 years after that, met my mother, a grad student in history. The couple that knew them both said, you guys will hit it off, and they did, and they fell in love and got engaged. And what did Dad tell Mom about his history when they were engaged? Honey, I had a little trouble at high school and in Princeton. Period. When did my mother know? When she became pregnant with me and pregnant with my sister. Dad wasn't around for my birth or my sister's birth. We know that women with a history of major depression are at some real risk during pregnancy and childbirth and afterwards for postpartum depression. It's a huge public health issue. Less well known is that men with the genetic vulnerability for bipolar disorder during partners' pregnancies are liable to get manic. Harder to come up with a strict hormone theory the way you might for postpartum depression. Lack of sleep. Back in the day then, prohibitions against sex during pregnancy, maybe some kind of existential belief or wondering about, am I going to bring somebody in the world who's had some of the experiences I've had? So when I was born, my sister was born, and all through the 50s and 60s, Dad would disappear for 3 months, 6 months, or when I was in 3rd grade, 12 months at a time, but nobody said anything. During and after some of those episodes, he asked his lead psychiatrist back in Columbus, who trained at Ohio State, what do I tell my dear children about these disappearances and my mental illness? And the psychiatrist looked him in the eye and said, if your children ever learn of your schizophrenia and psychosis and hospitalizations, they'll be permanently destroyed. You and your wife are forbidden from ever bringing up the topic. Doctor's orders. So as I write in a later chapter and in a kind of an aside, would an oncologist today say, oh, don't ever tell your children about your cancer, it'll permanently destroy them? Think though historically, in the 30s, 40s, and even through the 50s in the United States, if your parent or relative died of cancer, you would never put that in the obituary. Because cancer was a shameful disease you brought upon yourself by lack of moral character and fiber. What's going to happen this September and October? Turn on Fox or CBS and you'll see the big guys who are 6'6" and 240 who can run a 40-yard dash in 4.3 seconds, the NFL guys wearing pink knee socks in support of breast cancer. If the NFL behemoths have breast cancer as a cause, where's mental health as a cause? Who are the spokespeople? Well, we're getting ahead of the story. There are some, but not enough. What was it like growing up in Columbus under those kinds of conditions? I mean, in some ways, it was an idyllic childhood. Mom taught English at Ohio State. Dad was a philosophy professor. We had 50-yard line seats at Ohio Stadium for the Buckeyes when Woody coached them. I went to coach's night at the faculty club and sat on the knee of Woody Hayes, who was a very gentle man when he wasn't beating up linebackers for intercepting passes. Classic case of intermittent explosive disorder, if I may say so myself. What was it like? Throughout, no one could let on that anything had changed once Dad left or once he'd returned. We were all engaged in serious play acting, the costume stiff and the scenes perplexing, without rehearsal. Over time, we ended up pretending that we weren't pretending, enacting the ultimate in fantasy role play. Each performance was live, and we acted out our roles as though our lives depended on their success. Why were the most important things in our family's life such an ongoing mystery? Whatever lay behind the silence must have been so devastating that it would have destroyed all of us if brought into the open. Kids know when things aren't going well in a family. But if nobody talks about it, what are the kids' choices? This is obviously simplifying. Well, I guess you could A, believe that the world is a random, cruel place, or B, blame yourself. Terrible cost to self-image, but at least there's some control. Maybe if I don't ask, Dad will come back sooner. Maybe, why is he back cooking scrambled eggs for breakfast? I didn't, was there a hello? When did he return? But if I say anything, maybe he'll go away again. School and sports were my salvation, and the silence built upon itself. So here's just another snippet. I remember this vividly. First grade had ended. I noticed that Dad wasn't home. The air outside was warm, the pavement baking in the noonday sun. I asked once or twice, but Mom said he'd returned from his trip pretty soon, maybe a few more weeks. What trip? I inquired as softly as I could, but she said nothing more. One afternoon in the early summer, crossing the living room toward the back porch, I stopped short. Something seemed to be hovering nearby, though I couldn't quite figure out what. My skin grew cool. Soon my eyes were pulled upward as though by a magnet. With a start, I saw them, near the ceiling, a string of balloons. Incredulous, blinking, I looked outside through the porch where another strand hovered over the backyard. All those different colors. Had there been a parade nearby? Maybe some kind of celebration? Limp and deathly still, their tight skins glistening, they floated there without a sound. As I continued staring, it dawned on me that the balloons were filled with poison gas. Hidden by the stretched plastic skins, the molecules inside were pressing for release. The danger was huge. Thoroughly frightened by now, I scurried upstairs to my bedroom. Had this been a vision of some sort? To this day, I'm not certain. But I told myself back then that if I kept my eyes focused right in front of me, my gaze pointed straight ahead, I might never see them again. I knew nothing at age 5.5 of concentration camps. I knew nothing of stigma, but somehow symbolically, the poison gas was what was not spoken. It must have been that toxic. So in some ways it was symbolic of both a wonderful and a pretty troubling childhood. My mom was the hero. She couldn't even tell her own mother for decades that her husband had a mental illness. Grandmother wouldn't have understood. She was the one who had to talk with the department chair of philosophy once Dad's behavior had been so outrageous in class that he had to be committed yet again. Dad got tenure before he was 30. If he hadn't had tenure, he would have been fired from any job. Huge protective factor for our family. It would take too long to read, but there was an incident that Mom told me once I was a grad student here at UCLA when she was out for a visit, that it occurred when I was 4 and my little sister was 3. We're about 1.5 years apart. Late 50s, big black and white TV in the colonial house, our first house. Steve and Sally are asleep upstairs, and Mom and Dad get a few minutes to watch the black and white TV. And there was a live variety show on from Cincinnati, which, like Chicago, was a big broadcasting kind of beacon. But Mom had been worried because for the last week, Dad had been getting up at 5 in the morning and rushing to his basement study and scribbling notes and muttering, and she knew something was up. So that night in front of the television, a variety singer in a sequin dress was singing, swaying her hips, and Dad shouted, he said, "Don't you see it, honey? She's sending messages to me through her song." Clinicians, what's this called? An idea of reference, a kind of pre-paranoid specialized meaning in everyday events. We must go to the station in Cincinnati now so I can hear the voices in person. No cell phone. Steve and Sally asleep up the stairs 20, 25 feet away. Mom had a decision to make in 45 seconds. Let him drive off, probably never see him again, or go with him and attempt to change his mind and turn around and pray that her son and daughter would stay asleep. It was a Sophie's choice. She decided on split-second instinct to go with him before I-71 connected Columbus to Cincinnati. They made the 100 miles in about 80 minutes. Back roads, stopping for stop signs. Dad was in a rage. They found the broadcasting tower and found the station in Cincinnati about midnight. But the gates were locked. No 24-hour TV back then. And Mom said, honey, the singer will be on in another night. Steve and Sally are asleep. And Mom said, look, oh, you're right. And so they drove back in the car and drove 80 miles an hour back. Got home about 2:30 in the morning, and Sally and I were asleep in our beds. What if we'd fallen down the stairs? What if a neighbor had been called? What about Child Protective Services, neglectful mother, psychotic father? Who knows what would have happened? But that's what parents have to go through too much. No support, snap decisions, and this is why in the modern era, family support groups, all kinds of mental health advocacy groups, developmental disabilities advocacy groups have been such a godsend. So when did I learn about some of these passages? Some of what I checked out a little bit, junior high and high school, and basketball and ran track, had a girlfriend pretty early. Dad was away some. I wasn't smart enough to apply to college in California, but I applied back east, and I guess I could have gone to Maine, but I got about as far away from Columbus as I could in Cambridge at Harvard. Came back home for my first spring break thinking, well, I guess I'll spend a few days in Columbus and head back to my new life back east. One afternoon, Sally was at high school in 11th grade. My mom was over teaching at Ohio State, and Dad said, son, maybe if we spoke in my study, I could tell you some events from my life. I didn't know what was going on. We sat in a study at home with all the philosophy and science and history and literature books, and he told me about saving the world from the fascists and about Norwalk and about Byberry, and 45 minutes later I left that study on that April day thinking, my life has changed. My dad has chronic schizophrenia, and I went back to Harvard, and within a month or two in that fall I changed my major to psychology and social relations, started volunteering with kids, started taking child psychopathology courses with the young Dr. Baker, and I had a mission. But what about those nights I couldn't sleep? I was convinced that if I stayed awake all night, my mind would unravel, and by dawn, I would be psychotic like my dad and schizophrenic like my dad and end up in hospitals like Dad. And of course, whom did I tell? My roommates? Are you kidding? Girlfriends at Radcliffe or somewhere else? No. It took some years before I got the courage to talk with my sister and then brought my mom in, close friends, faculty, and then finally seeking some therapy to try to understand what had happened. So the revelation was a source of mission and wonder and a source of terror, and all through my career, working with kids, trying to develop treatment programs, what causes ADHD, other neurodevelopmental disorders, what about family intervention, what about peer groups, what about classrooms, I've always wanted to integrate the biological and the psychosocial side of things. Because Dad's treatment, as I learned, too often was, he was the third patient in the United States to receive Thorazine in 1953. His older brother, a psychiatrist, got him on it. Or he received psychoanalytic treatment, but it was never integrated. What do we now know about the modern genomics of mental illness? When I taught my real course here at UCLA 31 years ago, that was the week that Science magazine had on its cover the gene discovery for bipolar disorder. We were going to find the gene among the Pennsylvania Amish. There's no single gene. There's no single 50 genes. The same several hundred genes that confer risk to schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, autism, and ADHD are common. They're epigenetically expressed prenatally and in the early years of life, and then during the pruning of adolescence. The more we know, the less certain we are, except that we've got to integrate. Now, we have gone through some passages I've read. I'm going to show you a picture in a minute, but I've got one more passage to read, which comes back to UCLA. During my 5th year, I was an intern at the NPI before it became the Semel Institute. And I joined for a rotation the Affective Disorders Clinic directed by young Dr. K. Redfield Jamison, medical director Dr. Michael Gitlin. And here is, during the winter of that year, an experience I had in the Affective Disorders Clinic seminar. We'll lead off today's seminar with a question, stated Dr. Jamison from the head of the huge oval table. It's a thought experiment. Forthright, supportive, authoritative, and energetic, Jamison was a dream mentor and supervisor during my year-long internship, etc., etc. All 20 interns and psychiatry residents stopped their conversations. Jamison usually began by discussing a provocative new finding or article or sharing a clinical case. Why had she switched things up on us today? Project yourselves into the future, Jamison went on. Kay was just up in Berkeley 3 weeks ago, a guest lecture, and we went out to dinner, and it was terrific. Project yourselves into the future. Suppose you or your partner become pregnant, and there's a new screening test that can accurately detect the risk the fetus will develop bipolar disorder. If Jamison didn't have my attention before, she sure did now. Even though the risk for manic depression, she continued, would emanate not from a single gene, but from several in combination, the science might one day develop to be able to detect risk with real precision. Assume the screening test comes up positive, she went on. In other words, it's virtually certain that your child will develop manic depression. Jamison had now reached her conclusion. Here's the question. Under this scenario, how many of you would elect to have an abortion for yourself or your partner? We'll take a vote. Raise your hand if you select the abortion given such a result of the test. For a second, the room went silent. A few trainees looked around sheepishly while others glanced down. Jamison repeated her query, calling again for the straw poll. Only one thing was sure, my hand would remain glued to the table. My arm, in fact, began to ache from pressing down so hard on the wood surface. But as I looked up, every hand in the room was held straight up. Every hand except for mine and that of my best friend, Jay Wagner, a fellow intern and fellow Midwestern survivor of a gifted yet troubled family. Jay and I had connected early in the internship year, co-leading a group for people with bipolar disorder in the Affective Disorders Clinic supervised by Jamison. From a distance, I heard Jamison comment on the vote, yet I hardly followed the thread. As the hour concluded, Jay and I stole a glance at each other across the table before heading our separate ways to our packed schedules, eyes wide open and eyebrows raised. Did that just happen? Over the next days, I tried to salvage a moral. All the seminar participants had been learning about the devastation often associated with serious mood disorders through some of the most difficult patients at a specialty clinic on the West Coast. The clinic was a magnet for crisis cases, people whose manias had led to involuntary hospitalizations or whose depressions were resistant to traditional treatments. No wonder everyone had been so freaked out. But all the rationalization in the world couldn't remove the reality. The future leaders of the mental health field had just voted to eliminate my family from existence. That was quite an eye-opener. So we're going to show a few pictures, and then we'll wrap up, get some discussion going. Here's a photograph from 1923 in a Prohibition International newsletter, and the title of the photograph is The Motherless Hinshaw Boys. My Uncle Harold is over on the right of the wagon. Uncle Randall, the economist who visited Dad at Byberry, 8 years old, nice spiky contemporary hairdo. Over on the left of the wagon, Uncle Bob, Robert Patton Hinshaw, the first one out of the house in 36 to see his younger brother splayed on the sidewalk below, who told me decades later that that week he decided to become a psychiatrist and a psychologist. And he did. He got an MD and a PhD. He's 5. And then there's Virgil Jr., age 3 years and 4 months. If you lose a parent to death, is that a risk factor for developing a later mood disorder? Yes, but as we say in developmental psychopathology, what are the moderators and mediators of that finding? The key moderator is the age at which you lose the parent to death. Between 1 and 2, the relative risk of developing depression or bipolar disorder is very small. Above grade school, it's very small. 3 and 5 is the sensitive, if not critical, period. Attachment bonds haven't fully formed. Language isn't fully developed. So Dad was the only one among the 4 original boys to have lost his mother to cancer. She was 40 at that tender age of just about 3 and a half. My grandfather remarried a couple years later. His second wife was a missionary. My grandmother had been a missionary. Prohibitionist Quaker guy, likes missionary. Prohibitionist gals, we call that assortative mating. It screws up all the genetics in studies. And my dad's stepmother had run a junior high school for mission girls in Central America. And she later got my grandfather's permission to be the one to discipline Junior because he was the youngest and most pliable of the 4 original boys. They had 2 more subsequently. And so when the other boys were out of the house for a period of a number of years, if Dad had not lifted or put back the toilet seat or was a few minutes late for dinner, he would be switched repeatedly, and then later it turned into sexual abuse. So, obvious genetic predisposition to bipolar disorder. I figured out by my senior year of college that Dad probably didn't have chronic schizophrenia. I helped get him an accurate diagnosis. Obvious heritability of bipolar disorder is above 0.8. Genes play a big part in saying who develops this disorder and who doesn't. But the loss of a parent and then physical and sexual abuse, that's a lethal combination. We know from our own research at Berkeley, we have a large sample of girls we followed for nearly 20 years. The impulsivity that some of these girls show in childhood, also highly heritable, about 75%. If those girls with the early, severely impulsive combined form of ADHD have received physical or sexual abuse or neglect, by the age of 20, 34.5% had attempted their lives. It's the genes and the trauma coming together. There's Dad after Norwalk, valedictorian at Pasadena High, not long before his fateful decision to go to Stanford. Here's the 6 boys in the family during a family reunion in the late 40s. So, on the left, Uncle Harold. He was the one on the right of the wagon, tall, athletic kid who started drinking at 13 and died of alcohol poisoning. Talk about stigma in a prohibitionist home. Then Uncle Randall, a little slighter than the rest, became the economist, very tender to my dad, was chairman of the grad school at Claremont Graduate University for many years. Uncle Bob's there in the plaid shirt, 2 years older than Dad. All of these boys and my sister and me, and our maternal grandmother, and our 3 boys get migraines, starting at about age 11. Thank goodness our own boys are not too on the severe end. Uncle Bob probably had the worst migraines in the family. But remember, he had an MD and a PhD, and the pain was so bad he started prescribing himself barbiturates and then injecting himself and then getting gangrene and losing his leg and dying of kidney failure. So substance abuse. And then Dad, in his t-shirt, he's gained his weight back. He's an assistant professor before he met my mom, back out in California for a family reunion, looking very robust. And then the 2 boys on the 2 young men on the right are the half-brothers, the product of my grandfather and step-grandmother. They're in their 20s, the big guys are in their 30s. The two guys on the right have male pattern baldness. Older guys have full heads of dark hair. Male pattern baldness is carried through the mother to the son. Uncle Harvey in the sweater vest was found to have perfect pitch at 4, became a concert pianist at Carnegie Hall and a professor of music. Uncle Paul on the right, beautiful baritone voice, retired a few years ago after 47 years as a soloist with the LA Master Chorale. Male pattern baldness, musical ability. So I'm the son of Virgil Jr., third from the right. The firstborn son of Uncle Harvey, Chip Harvey Jr., was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder at 17. He thought he was Jesus. Somebody had hung him up on a basketball stanchion to be crucified, and he shot himself at 31, 2 months out of a mental hospital. Uncle Paul's oldest, my cousin Marshall, started Berkeley 3 years before I did, but didn't make it through his first term because he started hearing voices, and he's now in his 49th consecutive year of schizophrenia. 4 teeth left. I bring him food every couple weeks. His apartment in Berkeley is about as big as this podium, but he's out of the hospitals and he's taking his medicine now. The voices aren't quite as bad. So growing up, around the time when Dad disclosed to me, I started to learn about Cousin Chip and Cousin Marshall and wondered, where am I going to end up? Disclosure's good, but support is even better. I got my PhD from UCLA in clinical psychology, I'm proud to say, and Mom and Dad came out after graduation and we went up to Santa Barbara, and here's Dad and me at El Capitan State Beach. I had my mustache then. My wife, Kelly, whom I met some years later, said, as a couple of you in the audience know, Steve, the 70s ended a long time ago. And the mustache didn't stay long after that. So I just turned 30 and Dad's in his mid-60s, a little bit of a punch from the lithium he finally got. Gave him some episode-free years. Full head of dark hair, not everything's genetic. 5.5 years later, up at Stinson Beach, I had my first visiting appointment at Berkeley. Dad's hunched and stooped, he's lost 25 pounds. The Parkinson's had begun that took his life 5 years later. He was on Thorazine and Mellaril, that he probably didn't need to be on if mood stabilizers had been available in the 50s and 60s in our country, and he received a plethora of electroconvulsive therapy treatments in the 50s. We know how valuable ECT is for severe depressions these days, but not back then. It was a little bit more like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest back then, long pulses used indiscriminately. And I've always wondered if there's an iatrogenic effect of getting the wrong diagnosis and the wrong treatment for all those years. It was around this time that Dad and I had a conversation one evening, sitting around a swimming pool out in Palm Springs. Mom and Dad had bought a condo out there. And Dad looked me in the eye and said, son, I don't think I've ever told you this, but I've longed to have cancer my whole life. I thought, well, Dad couldn't take much lithium because he had kidney problems. And I thought, is he slipping into an episode? And I'm sure I looked concerned, and I said, Dad, what do you mean? He said, son, cancer is a real illness. Think what the term mental illness means to a philosopher. I've probably imagined all my symptoms. I'm sure all those hospitalizations are for my moral failings. If I'd had cancer, I would have had a real illness, and there would have been an explanation. Now, I thought I knew something about clinical psychology before I heard Dad say that. I mailed him articles that Kay Jamison recommended that I would find in the literature. He knew he had a heritable, biologically based illness called bipolar disorder at one level. At another level, he knew that he was that 16-year-old on the back ward of Norwalk where his bunkmates were people with microcephaly, as you might pick up today from being exposed to the Zika virus in utero, with misshapen heads. And as Dad wrote in one of his journals, I knew I had found my home as one of the flawed of the human race. The identity you form transcends the book learning you may do if during your developing years, that's the self-image you develop. I just mentioned this, but here's a slide for it. What's the story with serious mental illness over and over in every country? large to very large heritabilities for most forms. When combined with early adversity and trauma, the worst outcomes, whether it's ADHD in girls or whether it's bipolar disorder. I just wanted to tell you this before, and here's the slide. Language was revealing. If Dad had had cancer, he would have had a real illness. What could Mom and Dad, had the psychiatrist back in Columbus not been so misguided, the whole field back then actually, what could they have said about Dad's absences? Anything. So Bill Beardsley, professor at Harvard Medical School, former chair of child psychiatry at Boston Children's Hospital, is a colleague and a friend, and he developed a form of therapy that's now being promoted for lots of preventive work. And the form of therapy he developed back in the 80s was for families in which one or both parents has either depression or bipolar disorder, unipolar or bipolar. And in this 16-week therapy, it's now been streamlined and it's modularized for community use. But in this form of therapy, the parent needs medicine and individual therapy. That's the first premise. But in the family therapy over 16 weeks, the therapist works with the parents and kids to start to develop a narrative. So the kids are out in the playroom for a couple sessions, and the therapist says, okay, Mom and Dad, or Dad and Dad, or Mom and Mom, what are we going to start to practice telling your kids about your depression? And what do the parents inevitably say? Are you kidding? I'd never tell my kids that. It's the most shameful aspect of our lives. And the therapist says, now remember that consent form you signed. This is the purpose of, this is what we're doing here. So kicking and screaming, the therapist gets the family, the parents, to talk in kid-friendly language about Dad's drinking or Mom's absences or the time the police came or the unemployment or the stress or the yelling or whatever the irritable, depressive, or manic or whatever symptoms might have led the child to experience. The kids come back in, they spend the last few weeks of the treatment talking about the experiences the kids have had to prevent internalization. In 2 randomized trials, the kids, compared to more traditional family therapies, are doing better. 4 years later, without follow-up treatment, the kids getting this family therapy have markedly reduced rates of developing depression themselves. So to me, this is potentially revolutionary. We know that major depression, heritability of about 0.3 in men and 0.4 in women, bipolar disorder double that. But you can also cut off some of the intergenerational risk through accurate communication and child-friendly communication. The internalization is also part of that intergenerational transmission. I've got one more brief passage to read, and then we'll take some questions. My editor and I, the great Karen Wolney of St. Martin's Press, 2 years ago we were thinking, well, how do I end this book? And she said, why don't you take a couple of pages. You've mentioned the term stigma. There's no references or footnotes in the book. What do you think ought to be done? The mental health crisis remains firmly in place. 3 times more Americans die from suicide than homicide. But who would know of this fact from the news, which routinely features gun violence perpetrated against others, but almost never discusses the inner pain related to depression and suicidal thoughts? Around the world, suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death for people aged 15 to 24, and the leading cause of mortality for girls 15 to 20. Look it up. Go to the World Health Organization website. Taken together, mental illnesses account for more disability than physical illnesses. Mental disorders don't afflict them, a deviant group of flawed, irrational individuals, but us. Our parents, sons and daughters, colleagues and associates, even ourselves. 1/4 of the population will experience a significant mental disorder in a given year. Countless veterans and trauma victims suffer from PTSD. Rates of childhood conditions like autism and ADHD are skyrocketing. Eating disorders contribute to major health risks. Substance abuse devastates lives, especially via the current epidemic of opioid and heroin-related fatalities. Chillingly, serious mental illness reduces life expectancy by 10 to 25 years through risky behaviors, poor exercise and health habits, proneness to chronic physical disease, low access to health care, and self-destruction. Yet it takes on average over a decade for most people experiencing symptoms to seek help, linked to the shame and denial surrounding the entire topic. What if it took people 10 years or more to understand and treat symptoms of heart disease or cancer? The headlines would never stop. Reducing stigma, that other form of madness, far worse in its consequences than mental illness itself, will take coordinated strategies, enforcement of anti-discrimination policies, access to high-quality care, a far different set of media messages and images, personal contact that fosters empathy and compassion, and the replacement of silence with dialogue. Above all, humanization is the goal. Getting young people engaged in the fight for human rights is central to the entire effort. Each year that we maintain our current attitudes and practices is another year of lost productivity, wasted human potential, and unspeakable tragedy. It will require an unprecedented team effort to make a difference. The knowledge is there, and the pieces are in place. Do we have what it takes to mount the fight? I think we do. And on that note, thanks for listening, and let's have some questions. Okay, there's a microphone going over here. I'm going to take off my jacket and reveal my wires. Oops.
Thank you so much for that presentation. You may not know the answer to a couple of questions I have since you were probably a child, but I'm very interested in the fact that your father, who showed symptoms of severe mental illness, did not receive any medication. I think that was at Norwalk. I'm not sure.
Back when he was a teenager, there weren't any medications.
Right.
And then when he was an adult, there were essentially the wrong medications.
But he recovered to the degree where he actually got a doctorate, right?
Right.
And worked for, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 decades as a professor.
49 consecutive years at Ohio State.
And that's quite astonishing. And then he relapsed again. So that picture is something I have never encountered in our mental health world. I have a son who's been, 10 years now diagnosed. I'm wondering if medication is more of a problem than not, although I support it 1000%, but it makes me wonder how in the past people actually did recover without medication. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, I totally forgot now.
Okay. One's good enough. This isn't a working memory assessment for me, so this is good. So I talk about in the book, it doesn't sound like the mics are up enough, but I'm sure you can adjust it. So Dad had a form of bipolar disorder that today would be called Cade's disease, C-A-D-E'. Cade was the Australian psychiatrist in the outback in the mid to late 40s who, before there was informed consent or IRBs, thought that based on animal studies, lithium might be good to calm people with mania. And he was right. It's lucky he didn't kill them because they didn't do much therapeutic drug monitoring then. And the first patient he treated with lithium successfully also became the first case in recorded history to go off his lithium because he wanted to be manic again. So this is the story. Many people with bipolar disorder don't love to be on their medications. But named after Cade, who described people would escalate into hypomania and then stage 2 and 3, and they would hear voices when they were fully manic, and then they'd plummet back down and be perfectly normal. And then some years later or months, they would plunge into a depression. Dad had that kind of remarkable pattern of when he was doing fine in between, I just gave a talk back in my hometown of Columbus, Ohio last week, and a couple of dad's grad students were there, one of whom said, I never knew he had a mental illness, because I was there for 2 years getting a master's, and he was fine. Most people with bipolar disorder do go into manias and depressions, and then when you get what's called a mixed episode, the energy of the mania along with the despair of the depression mixed together, that's very lethal, highly predictive of suicide. And the episode clears, sometimes without treatment, but there's residual irritability and depression. Not that many people had Dad's kind of distinct pattern of being perfectly euthymic in between. But I didn't read enough of the epilogue. We don't have cures for bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, autism, etc. yet. But boy, do we have treatments that work just as well as, if not better than, in terms of effect size, most medical treatments for physical conditions. If people get access, if they're titrated to the right dose, and it might take months to get the right medicine and the right dose. What we know for almost all mental health conditions, and for anxiety disorders, it's even flipped, where psychosocial interventions are better than medications, is it's the combination of getting the right medication and the right support and skill building, family, individual, or both forms of psychological treatment. That's where you get the biggest effects. So, of course, I can't speak to any individual case, but medicines don't always work. Psychological treatments don't always work, but we need to disseminate the evidence-based treatments we have, which is a major goal for psychiatry and clinical psychology today.
Yes, just remember the other question, and it's important because as a mother, I'm trying to understand what the differences are between illnesses with psychosis and those with not. Illness awareness is a lot of us families have a big understanding that there is no illness awareness to help them get treatment. You may not know whether your father had that or not, but it is, in my opinion, at the core, the foundation of getting treatment. If you don't have illness awareness, you may not ever recover.
One of the biggest, quote, symptoms or side effects of psychosis, hearing voices, having delusional thoughts, etc., is that the rest of the world's at fault, but you're doing fine as far as you know. So it's a lack of awareness that there's a mental disorder going on. And certainly when Dad was at the height of his manias, he thought he was doing great, even though he was crashing and burning. So this is the paradox of paradoxes today. Not long after the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, the women's movement, by the late 60s, it was almost impossible to get anybody in any state involuntarily committed to a mental hospital. What did it take for my dad back in the 40s and 50s? 2 paragraphs from a psychiatrist and a judge's order, and he was put in the state hospital for how long? It's a trick question. Until the doctor said he was better. There was no term. It's a civil right not to be involuntarily committed against your will. So that's what we've adopted. And we've closed down. The population in state mental hospitals is reduced by 93% from 1955 till today. That's why LA County Jail is the largest public mental hospital in the country, et cetera, et cetera. So what are we talking about here? What do you do with magically you turn 18 and you're of the age of majority and you're not aware of your illness and your family desperately wants you to get treated, and so do your friends and loved ones, but you won't go. This is the paradox that we as a society are facing today. Should we reopen the snake pits? No, I don't think so. Should we have more hospital care for people who really need it, more than 3 days on an involuntary hold? Yes. Do we need a continuum of community care for people convicted of nonviolent, maybe drug offenses, etc.? Could there be a choice between involuntary outpatient treatment versus jail? Some states are doing that. We've got a long way to go to fully recapture the civil rights of people with mental disorders. So rather than taking this seminar till midnight, let's go to the next question. Okay, Mike Guy, you do it.
You've given us a gift by telling your story. And I think one of the important things beyond what you've already said about what needs to be disseminated, Steve, is the story. I think the moving part of what you've done so well here tonight is to give us an opportunity to get a glimpse into the people who are your family, and to have some understanding of the strengths and the difficulties that are blended together in such a complicated way. And it seems to me that getting that kind of story out in the articulate way in which you just told it is a very important thing to do. I think especially in terms of the training of mental health workers and professionals who work in the field. There's all too little of this storytelling of this kind. But also to make it more available to parents and other people who need it. The medicine helps, the education is important, I think, to pave the way to the people to be able to get what they need when they need it. And you've just done it so magnificently here.
Well, I appreciate it, Tom. I mean, I appreciate it. I went on an epilogue with a few more statistics, but we humans are evolved to like tales with beginnings, middles, and ends, and all the statistics in the world really don't capture us the way a story does. And I think you're right. And for those of you who don't know Dr. Tom Brown in the audience, he's moved out to California now, and I think he'll be my new agent, so thanks very much.
I have the microphone.
Yeah.
My son is diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, and I'm also a clinician. There's a growing body of literature about, at least with schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, to think about it as an altered state. Mm-hmm. And that trauma can absolutely affect those who are with this diagnosis. Yeah. And it's another way to, I think, conceptualize it. There's also the Hearing Voices Network, which I think really helps, and none of this is instead of medication, but I think it helps bring it out of the shadows.
Absolutely.
So there's not such devastating labels for many people. And I think it's choice for the individual and the loved ones helping them, but it's another way to think.
I think we need alternative perspectives. I mean, the epidemiologists have recently found out something that we didn't quite know before. Pretty large percentages of the population hears voices from time to time. Mm-hmm. You don't have to have schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or severe bipolar disorder. Is autism a neurodiversity? Right? Maybe. I mean, how many of my professor colleagues at Berkeley are somewhere on the spectrum? We won't count, but enough. But what about the parent of a mute autistic child who's self-mutilating?
Right, that's different.
You cross a threshold and it's a mental illness or developmental disorder that needs
and I think
treatment.
That's actually, the DSM is recently changing that it's a psychotic spectrum disorder.
That's right.
And not labeling in such distinct categories.
Right, and just we got to go into more questions, but yeah, when I was in grad school and undergrad, you either had autism or you didn't.
Right.
You had bipolar disorder. When we call it autism spectrum disorders now. Mm-hmm. Bipolar disorders on a spectrum, everything is. It's hard to think of any form of mental disorder that is truly a distinct category.
Correct.
So that's what you're talking about.
Speaking to the stigma topic of the day, I just wanted to say that my son, who was diagnosed bipolar when he was 16, didn't like what mental illness said, and he chose to say that he had a brain disorder. Mm-hmm. And he felt that, and whenever I say this to other bipolar people, they go, yes, 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 it just brings it more into that more valid physical realm that we so badly need to get that to validation. So I think maybe the whole term mental illness is just doing us under.
Yeah, and I'll make a comment on that. I think this is an important point, but about 25, 30 years ago, the National Institute of Mental Health started reading work by social psychologists, so-called attribution theory. If you see somebody behaving aberrantly and you think they're just being weird, you blame them. But if you think it was a seizure, you have empathy and you blame it. It's a brain disorder. There's now been a number of studies, both with college students and with older adults, in which you read a vignette or you're going to meet somebody with a mental disorder and you're led to believe either A, it's a brain disorder caused by genes, or it's the result of stress and psychosocial influences. The brain disorder attribution clearly has the audience, if you will, blame the person less. but it also increases their feelings of hopelessness for the person and makes the individual want to stay further away from them. So this is called, Nick Haslam is our colleague in Australia, it's the mixed blessings model. Simply saying all forms of mental illness are brain diseases caused by genes, A, is inaccurate because it's the combinations of genetic vulnerability and life experience, and B, mental illness doesn't behave social psychologically the way that other disorders do because we're still afraid of the symptoms, because it's still bound in mystery. So I think for your son it's the right choice, and we certainly don't want to convey the belief that mental illnesses are the products of animal spirits or weak personal will or moral fiber, but I think it's not the panacea to just say they're brain diseases and everybody will feel sympathetic. It's more complicated than that. So I think we got to go on. We're almost at 8:30. So a couple more questions. Who's got the mic?
Hi. I'm having an issue with the fact that whenever there's a school shooting or anything of that sort, the word mental illness that covers the size of the United States, and yet it's put into one comment, one statement. It doesn't seem fair if we're throwing in anxiety and depression all the way to psychosis. Doesn't seem realistic or helpful.
It's not helpful, it's not realistic. People with serious mental illness, even psychotic forms, are 5 times more likely to be victimized by violence than to perpetrate. That never makes the headlines. If you have a delusion of control, if I believe that you're out to get me, I might act violently to stop you from doing that. But if I get treatment, that risk of violence goes down to baseline. What's said and fostered is reinforcing the old stereotypes, and all it takes is one picture of another deranged-looking young man who shot up a school to perpetuate the stereotypes for a long time. So media has better guidelines now about reporting on suicide and mental illnesses, but in this day and age, with the concerns about gun violence, the mentally ill are the convenient scapegoat. Let's do a couple of more. Here's our mic guy coming up front, stealthily.
With the opioid crisis that's national and growing, and so many beautiful young children and young adults and adults, would this not lead to major new group of mentally ill that it would foster some kind of chain reaction? They're trying to come off the drugs, off of alcohol, and where's the help?
Where's the help? Possibly receiving more stigma than mental illness is substance abuse, which is of course listed as a form of mental illness because you put that stuff in your body or your bloodstream. That's right. Right? So I didn't have time to mention, but my mom's brother back in Columbus, a wonderful guy, 4 years younger than mom. They both lost their dad when they were very young, and his Uncle Buddy's daughter, Ellen, my cousin, and her husband, Paul, have 2 wonderful boys, 30-year-old getting his PhD in religious study, and a few years ago, their 20-year-old school athlete, pretty bad ADHD, got treated, but he had a sports injury, started taking oxy, then heroin was the alternative, and they found him dead in his car the day after rehab. This is the religious conservative family in Columbus, Ohio that it doesn't happen to. It happens everywhere. Right, and we're a bit shielded from it in California. What's the solution? Oh boy. So this is, I mean, if you read the Times just 2 days ago, we can't go back and deny people treatment for pain. We ignored pain for too long. But there may be non-opioid alternatives. There's certainly yoga, relaxation, meditation that may help some people not needing medications. I think, and I write a lot about and talk about ADHD and stimulant medications, and they're used by people without ADHD. That will be the topic of our breakfast seminar tomorrow, so thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Hinshaw.
Okay, thanks.
I think Dr. Brown said it all. This was very accurate.
Thank you.
And I hope that many more people get to hear your story because it is so moving and so important, and everybody should hear this. So thank you for coming from UC Berkeley.
Thank you. The trip down was great until I got on the 405. That's all I can say.
Come see the movie. There's a traffic jam on the 405. I paid $14
so much.
Okay, good.